bin Abi Talib came in and said, "Peace be on you, O daughter of the Prophet of Allah." I replied, "And upon you peace, O father of Hassan and the commander of the faithful." He then said, "Fatima, I smell a sweet fragrance like that of my brother, my cousin, the Prophet of Allah." I replied, "Yes, he is underneath the cloak with his two sons." So Ali went near the cloak and said, "Peace be on you, Prophet of Allah. May I enter the cloak with you?" He replied, "And upon you peace, my brother, my legatee, my successor, and my standard bearer. You are given the permission to enter." So Ali entered the cloak with them. Then I stepped forward and said, "Peace be on you, my father, O Prophet of Allah. May I enter the cloak with you?" He replied, "And upon you peace, my daughter, O part of myself. You were given the permission to enter." So I entered the cloak with them. Getting together underneath the cloak, my father, the Prophet of Allah, held the two ends of the cloak and raised his right hand towards the heavens and prayed, "O Allah, these are the people of my household, Ahlul Bayt. These are my confidants and my supporters. Their flesh is my flesh and their blood is my blood. Whoever hurts them hurts me too. Whoever displeases them displeases me too. I am at war with those at war with them. I am at peace with those at peace with them. I am the enemies of their enemies, and I am the friends of their friends. They are from me, and I am from them. O Allah, bestow your blessings, benevolence, forgiveness, and your pleasure upon me and upon them, and remove impurity from them and keep them thoroughly pure." Then the Lord Almighty Allah said, "O my angels, O residents of my heavens, verily I have not created the erected sky, the stretched earth, the illuminated moon, the bright sun, the rotating planets, the flowing seas, and the sailing ships, but for the love of these five lying underneath the cloak." Gabriel, the trusted angel, asked, "Who are underneath the cloak?" The Almighty answered, "They are the household of the Prophet and the assets of prophethood. They are Fatima, her father, her husband, and her two sons." Gabriel said, "O Lord, may I fly to earth to be the sixth of them?" Allah replied, "Yes, for given the permission." So Gabriel, the trusted, landed near them and said, "Peace be on you, O Prophet of Allah." The highest conveys his peace and you and his greetings, and says, By my honor and glory, O my angels, O residents of my heavens, verily I have not created the erected sky, the stretched earth, the illuminated moon, the bright sun, the rotating planets, the flowing seas, and the sailing ships, but for your sake and love. God has given me permission to enter the cloak with you. May I join, O Prophet of Allah?" The Prophet replied, "And peace be on you, O trusted bearer of Allah's revelations. You are granted the permission." So Gabriel entered the cloak with us and said to my father, "Allah sends his revelations to you. Verily Allah's desire is to remove blemish from you, O people of household Ahlul Bayt, and purify you with the perfect purification." Then Ali said to my father, "O Prophet of Allah, tell me what significance has Allah given for getting underneath the cloak?" The Prophet replied, "By him who rightfully appointed me a prophet and chose me as a messenger for the salvation of the mankind. Whenever and wherever an assembly of our followers and friends mentions this event, Allah will bestow on them His blessings and mercy. Angels will encircle them, asking Allah the remissions of their sins until the assembly disperse." So Ali said, "Verily, by the Lord of the Kaaba, we and our followers are the winners." Then my father replied, "By him who rightfully appointed me a prophet and chose me a messenger for the salvation of the mankind. Whenever and wherever an assembly of our followers and friends mentions the event, there shall remain none grieved, but Allah will remove his grief. There shall remain none distressed, but Allah will dispel his distress. There shall remain none wish seeker, but Allah will grant his wish." All happily said, "Verily, by the Lord of the Kaaba, we and our followers are the winners and the blessed in this world and the next."
Jazakallah khair jazaa, Brother Hani. Thank you so much for that wonderful recitation of Hadith Qissa. At this time, we kindly request Syed Shabbir Kirmani to please take the number. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
If you could please recite a Surah Al-Fatiha for the departed souls of Syed Zahir Haidar Zadi, Sayyidah Raisa Khatun, Sayyid Azhar Sajjad, Mahmouda Begum, Sayyidah Aziza Zadi, Al-Fatiha, and for your marhameen. Fatiha. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. فوض أمري إلى الله إن الله بصير بالعباد ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. حسبنا الله ونعم الوكيل ونعم المولى ونعم النصير. والصلاة والسلام والتحية والإكرام على الرسول المسدد المصطفى الأمجد المحمود الأحمد الذي سمي في السماء بأحمد وفي الأرض بأبي القاسم محمد، اللهم صل عليه، وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين المنتجبين الذين أذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا. وقل رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. أما بعد، قال الله تبارك وتعالى في كتابه الكريم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم، إن الدين عند الله الإسلام. My respected elders, brothers and sisters in Iman, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, wherever you may be in Maryland or across the globe. Question: what does American Islamic culture look like? Earlier this year, I had the opportunity to be in a particular town. It was called, or city, it was called Bhavnagar in India. It's in the state of Gujarat. And I was walking down the streets and driving down the streets, and I noticed it was very different than any other town I've been in the world in. You see that anywhere that you go in this town, you will find that there are cows and cattle everywhere. They are literally on the streets. They are literally in the alleyways. They are literally everywhere you can look. That the passing by cars are stopped because of these cows, these cattle, these buffalo, and those people who are walking are stopped. And you are not allowed to touch them whatsoever. This is one paradigm of the world. At the same time, if you come to another part of the world, you find that people sit on chairs. You may be sitting on a chair right now watching this. You may be, for example, sitting on a chair, or you may have sat on a chair before. You may find that other societies around the world don't sit on chairs. In fact, you may find that chairs are not the best form of sitting if you look at our physiology. They actually may not be conducive for that at all. The idea being that somebody who looks like at a town like Bhavnagar may say that this seems like a waste, this seems like it's inefficient. The cars and the traffic is being stopped because of these animals, there may be pollution due to the droppings and other factors. But you may be saying that this doesn't make sense. But to that world, and that culture, and that environment, it makes sense. You see, when I look at another culture, when I look at another environment, and I impose my own values on that culture, on that environment, without looking at that culture and that environment from the lens of those individuals there on the ground, that's called ethnocentrism. That's a word that you want to look up and you want to make sure that is in your vocabulary. Ethnocentrism is when I look at another culture, another environment, another society, maybe even another religion, and I begin to say that things shouldn't be that way because I see things differently. And you may not realize it, but many of the issues that we have in our world arise from this ethnocentrism. For example, I see that, for example, I do things a certain way. I do azah a certain way. I do ma'tam a certain way. I do latam a certain way. I commemorate Aba Abdullah a certain way. I do things a certain way. And I begin to think that the way I do it is the only way to do it. And I begin to think that my way or the highway. This is all a form of ethnocentrism. You see, in a university, many of us have gone to university and many of us continue to go to university. When you go to university pre-COVID, prior to COVID, you go to the front and you will notice that everyone's sitting down in the lecture hall. At the same time, at the front, usually, typically, would be the professor, who is oftentimes standing. And the professor would be standing while everyone else sat. Have you ever thought about where the term chair came from? The chair of a department, chair of linguistics, chair of philosophy, chair of mathematics, chair of physics, chair of XYZ subject. This is what it's called at the university level. Why is it called that? If you know the heritage and the root of it, you will find that that comes from the Arabic word kursi. The first institutions of higher education can be traced back to, for example, in Fez in Morocco, for example, the likes of the university, for example, Al-Azhar, which used to be called Al-Zahra University, before Salahuddin Ayyubi conquered it and changed to Al-Azhar, and the Hawza al-Ilmiya in Najaf. These are the three oldest continuous universities in the world. The Qaraween and Fez, that's the first one which I mentioned. They used to have an environment where the teacher would sit on the chair and everyone else would, for example, stand or sit on the floor. And so that chair that the professor or the instructor sat on was called the chair. And that is the heritage of where it comes from in our modern world. The question I want to ask you and I, because we've been discussing Islam and culture, is what does Islamic American culture look like? Or American Islamic culture look like? And how is it that we can go about creating that? Because a culture is something that is vital. We gave the example of a vessel and the liquid yesterday. And I reminded you that this will be a philosophical and a slightly intellectual conversation. But this is a needed conversation for the future of our community. You see, some of the biggest questions that arise in our modern world had not been answered in the mind of a generation that has been growing up between two worlds. A world of, for example, the subcontinent, a world of, for example, the Middle East, a world, for example, North Africa, or otherwise, and then adapting to the modern world of Europe or North America. And in that environment, many a times, a young person gets confused. Rasulullah, when he came with Islam, he came forward and gave the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he took the culture of the Arabs, the pagan Arabs of Jahiliyyah, and transformed it. When he changed and took that and he transformed it, similarly, that migration occurred from Arabia towards Persia, towards the subcontinent, and from there throughout the world. For example, you'll find people who trace their lineage to the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, those Sadat, or Hassani, or Husseini, or for example, or Abidi, or Ja'fari, or Baqari, or whatever you have you, many of them trace their ancestry back to, for example, Persia, or for example, Afghanistan, or for example, wherever it was, because of the persecution that took place, they had to disperse. The idea being that we need to understand that as these religions moved, as these individuals moved from place to place and locality to locality, the dynamics in their culture changed. The way they commemorated Abu Abdullah Hussein changed. This was a natural progression. Similarly, this will happen in the United States. The question that you and I have to ask is, are we going to tend to these issues? Are we going to address these issues? Are we going to look after these issues? Because I, having been born and raised here, grown up here, like many, if not all of you listening here, who have been here a substantial part of your life, we have to understand that this is our land, this is our home. And as part of being home, Rasulullah himself says that patriotism, or having a love and affinity for one's nation is part of faith. Therefore, what happens on the political front in the United States is part of my responsibility. Therefore, what happens at a social front is my responsibility. Therefore, what happens at a societal level is my responsibility. I cannot live here and live in an environment where I am detached, and live in an environment where things that are happening around me have nothing to do with me in my mind. That is, when there's an issue of social justice that is on the line, that is my responsibility. I have some role to play there. If there's an issue, for example, with respect to the political scenario, I have some capacity to do something there. I am to do it. Therefore, we need to start looking at what is American Islamic culture, and how do we cultivate it? Because we need to be part of creating that culture, and not simply take that culture from someone else telling us what our religion or our faith or our culture should be. Therefore, in tonight's analysis, I want to understand a few major themes with you. Number one, what is it that Rasulullah prophesied and said that this is Islam today, and what will be the era of Islam towards the advent and the end of times when my son, the Mahdi, returns? What will the world look like? What will the world be like? Number two, I want to understand, how did we get here? What did the Renaissance, what did the Enlightenment period of Western Europe have to do with how we got here and how we got the mindset as to what we believe? What is Orientalism? What is Occidentalism? How does this influence how I operate in my world? I want to then look at, once we understood how we got here, where do we go from here? That is, the issues of political engagement, civic engagement, the issues of, for example, dealing with social justice, the issues of, for example, mental health, the issues that are surrounding our society, not outside our community, in our communities, of substance abuse, the issues of divorce, the issues of marital problems, the issues of stigmatizing people. The issue of considering, for example, this idea, do we have a world where we actually give support to people and have support groups? These are all things that we'll look at. And we'll look at how the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam shared a worldview through their Islamic and cultural principles and basis. And we'll see how the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam exemplified this in Karbala and Kufa and Sham. This is our schedule and agenda for the brief moments that we have together, inshallah. From the bottom of your heart, wherever you may be, in Maryland, across North America, in Europe, or across the world, send a salawat on Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa Ali Muhammad. Rasul al-A'zam, Muhammad Mustafa, has a beautiful tradition and also an alarming tradition. There are many traditions that the Prophet and the Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam have highlighted. They have said that, for example, after Rasulullah established Islam went through a situation, a scenario where it was flourishing during the time of Rasulullah, during especially the Madani periods, the periods in Medina. That 10 years, 13 years in Mecca, 10 years in Medina, that 10-year period, especially culminating with the conquest of Mecca or Fatih Mecca, Islam was at its peak. But Rasulullah and the Imams after Rasulullah prophesied and said there will come a time on this ummah, on this nation, that will be a very difficult time. Rasulullah himself says there will be a time in this world where the dynamics will shift. How will they shift? Rasulullah says, number one, people will neglect the next world and focus on this world solely. That is, they'll say that there's no future, there's no other world, there's no hereafter, there's only this world. Rasulullah saying. He says then they'll love the wealth more than anything. That they will forget the akhirah, they'll forget the next day of reckoning, the day of judgment. Rasulullah saying. Number one, they will forget the akhirah altogether. Number two, they will forget the day of judgment and focus on accumulation of wealth. Furthermore, he says they will focus on buildings, that is buildings and constructions, and they will forget the graves, Rasulullah is saying. And finally, he says that there will come a time where people will get to this place where they will forget their Lord and focus solely on themselves. They'll become self-centered. That means that there may be progress, because we have traditions that say there will be a time where people will, for example, listen to music, or music will come from their pockets. People could not prophesize that at that time or understand what that meant. But today we may be able to understand with the technology. You see, but Islam understood there may be scientific progress, there may be material progress, there may be progress in terms of how long people are living, but there will be a decline in terms of morality, there may be a decline in terms of ethics, there may be a decline in terms of the social fabric of society. And that's really what Rasulullah alluded to. We're told towards the time of Imam Sahib al-Asr wal-Zaman, the Zuhur, it will be so difficult to keep your iman, that somebody will leave in the morning and they'll come back at night, they won't have iman. They'll leave with iman in the morning. At night they will have no iman in their heart. We're told you will be sifted and sifted and sifted, like the gold is sifted, until very few of you remain. That means there will be a social decline. There will be a denigration. Furthermore, when we discuss culture, there is a hadith that is not often recited, but it is one from Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, where he tells us that, for example, reciting poetry in particular in a few different states, for example, in the state of Ihram, for example, on a Friday or a Friday night as well, the Imam alayhi salam has said, these are things that are highly detested, that one should not do. Ayatollah Nasir Makarim Shirazi, when he comments on this, again, we're talking about culture. I've told you, Islam highly encourages a certain type of poetry. He says, what is this about? He says, if you look at what the Imam says, he's talking about the poetry of the era of Jahiliyyah. The era pre-Islam, those poets were focused on particular themes and particular topics. And I want you to understand this so you understand our modern world. What was the pre-Islamic Arabian poet talking about in his poetry? Number one, he was talking about self-aggrandizement. He was talking about how I'm the best in the world. I'm the most important thing. I, me. That was his focus. Number two, he was talking about lust. He was talking about women, and he was talking about the things that have to do with women. The next level of what he was talking about was he was trying to bring the other person down. He was trying to denigrate and dishonor the other person. So he would disrespect the other tribe. He would say that this is wrong with you, and this is wrong with your lineage, and this is wrong with you, in a way that he would try to demoralize them and bring them down. And finally, he would go after and say that there's nothing, this life is everything. Ayatollah Nasir Makarim Shirazi, in this commentary, he says that the Imam is talking about this. that if you are going to delve in poetry, Islam doesn't encourage you to do it unless it's Islamic poetry, unless it's poetry for justice, unless it's poetry for peace, unless it's those things. Islam doesn't encourage it. But if you're going to do it, at least don't do it on a Friday. At least don't do it in a haram. At least don't do it on Friday night, Shabbir Jummah. How would that relate to you as a young Muslim growing up in America? Look at the music charts in our modern world. I don't encourage you to listen to it. However, if you look at it, there are certain themes that are there. Those themes are the same themes that were going on in pre-Islamic Arabian Jahiliyyah. I am the best, for example. Self-grandeur. The same themes of, for example, lust. The same themes of roasting the other side or bringing them down. Islam was against these principles. So if you're going to listen, for example, at least try to make an effort to not listen on a Friday or a Shabbir Jummah, Thursday night. These are holy, sacred times. The same with Ihram. So these are the principles which Islam laid out in order for us to understand what is our worldview. How do we see the world? What ethics should we have? What morality should we have? How should we operate in our modern world? But that same young Muslim who's growing up in America can pick up their pen and can write a poem which may be secular but is still about social justice, to speak up for the rights of our brothers and sisters, for example, who are African American. But you know, this issue of African American is not just an African American issue. Just today, a young black man in Italy was killed by 4 white men. So this is a global phenomenon. You and I have a role to play here. We cannot just say that this has nothing to do with the followers of Ahlul Bayt. The Ahlul Bayt's followers should be at the forefront of justice. And so the young Muslim is wondering, I'm coming to the Imam Barga, I'm coming to the Husayniyah. No one's talking about social justice. No one's talking about the civic engagement. But my social media is lit up with these topics. This is part and parcel of my deen. This is part and parcel of my iman. But these issues have not been brought to the forefront. The Ahlul Bayt stood for these. Now, we may say the method the Ahlul Bayt chose was different. Imam al-Hussein rose in the form of battle, but Imam al-Hassan, he did a peace treaty. Imam Sajjad used du'as. Imam al-Baqir, Imam al-Sadiq, they used the institution of Medina, the University of Medina. The other Imams had different means to go about that same end. But I want you to consider for a moment, how did we get here? This is a very important concept. You may have been colonized intellectually, although you may not realize it. Allow me to explain. Before this, I mentioned last night that when you look at beyond culture, the work, and you realize that culture has certain dynamics, one is the way language, the way people talk. For example, at the level of language, there is the idea of what you say. I gave the example of English versus Native American language. In the Quran and Arabic has a very deep meaning. For example, the concept of time. You see, time in our modern world is linear. There's my birth and there's my death, and all the time I have in between, that's all I have. And therefore my time is extremely valuable in this world, that's all that matters. But in other societies, it's fluid. And so I prioritize certain things. I may prioritize my family. I may prioritize a majlis, for example. I may prioritize certain things. In Islam, for example, if you want to understand the concept, look at the Quran. There is a very famous surah titled Surah Al-Asr, Wal-Asr. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Wal-Asr. Inna al-insana lafi khusr. This means asr, typically we're told is time. But I want to draw your attention to something else. Question, sometimes people ask, where are the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam in the Quran? If you want, for my youngsters, always remember, and young and old alike, the first place, the clearest place that you can understand, according to all Muslims, without any doubt whatsoever, is Surah Al-Insan, also known as Surah Dahr. That is the time, where the verse begins, or the surah begins, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, that هَلْ أَتَاءَ الْإِنسَانُ حِينًا مِنَ الدَّهْرِ لَمْ يَكُنْ شَيْئًا مَذْكُورًا. Was there not a time that you are not worth mentioning, O man? But what is this dahr? This one, where Fatima and Amir al-Mu'mineen, Fatima Zahra salamullahi alayha, Amir al-Mu'mineen, Al-Hassan, Al-Hussein, the Imaman, and Fidda, they give away their bread. وَيُطْعِمُونَ الطَّعَامَ عَلَى حُبِّهِ مِسْكِينًا وَيَتِيمًا وَحَسِيرًا. That's directly in the Quran. All Muslims accept that was revealed for Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam, no doubt about it. But that's called Surah Al-Insan, or man, but it's also called Surah Dahr. Dahr means time. Hold on. Dahr means time? Asr means time? One surah is called Surah Al-Asr, one is called Surah Dahr. If they were the same time, then they would be the same word. But it's not the same word. Why Asr? Why Dahr? When you go to the Mufassirin, they say that it's a different time. What do you mean? Asr means the declining day, the day that is ending. When is Salatul Asr, for example? The time of Salatul Asr. Many times, nowadays, maybe 4 or 5 o'clock, wherever you may be geographically. It's towards the end of the day, the declining day, as in, and when you recite the verses, you begin to understand, Wal Asr, Innal insana lafi khusr, that by time, man is at loss. But what time? Declining time, that is the life of this world, is ending. But what is the term that Allah used for dahr? هل أتى على الإنسان حين من الدهر لم يكن شيئا مذكورا. The Quran says that recall, does man not recall that there was a time where he was not worth mentioning? Dahr, that dahr means endless time. Subhanallah, God. One is saying ending, declining day, asr. The other one is saying that it is the endless time. What do you mean? That had you not existed and had we not put you in creation, Allah is saying, as if Allah is saying, that had we not created you, that endless time, you would have not existed, and that time would have continued forever. You see, unending time is the hereafter in the Islamic framework. And how you see the world matters. It has a tremendous impact on how you see the world. What lens do you see the world with? If you go further, there are certain social norms. Recall the example I gave you last night that I told you I would conclude today. You check into your hotel in Japan. When you check into your hotel in Japan, you drop off your luggage and you leave the room. You come back after an hour and you notice your belongings are no longer there. And there's in fact another family there. You know, this is very common in Japanese culture. Why? Because they would accommodate a family that needs the room as opposed to you as an individual or 1 or 2 people, and they would move your luggage on your behalf. In America, this would be seen as an invasion of privacy. This would be something of the highest order that would be the rudest thing someone could possibly do. You not only shifted me without my permission, you took my baggage as well. But in Japan, it's not like that. They see it as communal. They're not individualistic like you and I. So they say that, well, you're part of the family now. And it would only make sense for you to make space for another family that needs more space. And on top of that, we're being kind and compassionate to move your things for you. Now, you may say that I come from this culture in America and I find that rule. Don't do that to myself. But do you have the right to come forward and say, I'm telling you, you shouldn't do that to yourselves either? That's ethnocentrism. You see, when we come towards many of the issues in our modern world, when we come to, for example, the issue of education, when we come to the issue of, for example, the moon sighting, and we say that Eid, for example, should be on this day, we apply ethnocentrism to our maraji in our Najaf and Qom without realizing it. We start saying that they should know this, they should know this, they should listen to us, they should... Listen, I have no problem with you in a respectful manner. You're speaking to them, writing to them, discussing with them, that's fine. But for you and I to come forward and be ethnocentric and say that you have to do it our way, we need to reconsider that. That would be like me going to Japan and telling the Japanese, you need to do things my way. You know, our modern world wouldn't exist had we not had some of those inventions that came from that part of the world. There are different civilizations. I say this because you need to understand where we came from on this regard. I say this in a world and an environment where there's gross unhappiness in our world. What do I mean? A study conducted at Dartmouth College, an Ivy League institution in the northeast of America, needs no introduction. The researchers wanted to find, when are people in developed and developing economies the happiest in their life? Again, I reminded you, this is the intellectual conversation, but this is vital for the future of our community. When are people the happiest in society? And when are people the saddest in society? They found that in developed and developing societies, such as North America, such as Europe, such as these countries, Western Europe in particular, people are happiest at the age of 18. And from 18 all the way to the age of 30, to the age of 40, to the age of 50, people are very unhappy. Happiness declines from the age of 18, according to researchers at Dartmouth College. And you know, when you get back to your age of 18 happiness, it's a U shape. So peak is at 18, all the way down, you have to get back up until the age of 65 to get back to your 18-year-old happiness level. Why is that? Do you know what the peak of unhappiness is in developed and developing economies? What age? It's 47. 47 in developed economies, 48 in underdeveloped economies or developing economies. That means at 47 and 48, why are people so unhappy in a modern developed world? In a modern developed society where we have the best healthcare, we have the best economics, where we have the best of anything in the world that you could hope for? How is that possible? That people are progressively getting less and less happier. You can check the research yourself. In fact, economists have found such a strong link between economic development and unhappiness that they say that if you see unhappiness in a society increasing, you can infer that means that economic development is taking place. Why is that? What's going on in our world? What's going on in our society? I mentioned that it's not a trivial matter that in the 20th century, after the Industrial Revolution, that is 1900 to 2000, that era, that is when people started leaving California to go to India, such as Steve Jobs and others, to seek spirituality. They understood something was missing from the equation. But I tell you, my young Muslim youth, or young or old alike, doesn't matter. You don't need to go to, for example, Buddhism or some other type of spiritual philosophy to try to get tranquility in your life. You know, we compartmentalize in our world. We say, for example, that I will have religion on a Friday night, or a Saturday, or a Sunday, for a few hours a day of that day. Islam's not about compartmentalization. I'm a Muslim at work, I'm a Muslim at school, I'm a Muslim at every moment in my life. It's not, spirituality is not that I do yoga for a few hours, although that may be a positive thing. I'm not questioning anyone who does it. What I'm saying is, what about the wealth of spirituality, the ocean of spirituality that is within our own belief system? I remember the Dalai Lama, the head of Tibetan Buddhism, the Dalai Lama, the 14th Dalai Lama who's alive. He's in a gathering in the United States. And I say this in the aftermath of 9/11, which was yesterday. He says, my friend tells me that the word jihad, as you know, holy war doesn't exist in the Quran. That word doesn't exist whatsoever. It's a modern concoction. He says, I'm told that jihad actually means not what we are told it means in the media. He says, my friend tells me that there was a moment in time where the Prophet of Islam came forward and came back, and he saw people coming back from the battlefield. And when they were coming back from the battlefield, he says, congratulations to those who are coming back from the minor struggle and going towards the major struggle. What major struggle? The struggle of the self. So the Dalai Lama says, if this is the definition of jihad, then all of Buddhist philosophy is summed up in jihad. That is, Buddhism is nothing more than the concept of jihad within Islam. The struggle with oneself, the struggle with the ego, the struggle with the nafs. But we haven't looked at it that way. We're going other places to try to get our spirituality in our lives. So the first step of tonight is to understand, how did we get here in this belief system? And second of all, how can we build once we've understood that? I mentioned to you the example of the grocery store yesterday and how we are influenced by our environment every single day, although we may not realize it. To understand where we came from in our modern world, you need to know some history. You need to know the Renaissance in the 1500s, roughly 500 years ago. You need to know the Enlightenment period, roughly 200 to 300 years ago. Between these two eras, the 1500s and the 1800s, our modern world was created, whether you realize it or not. So in the Renaissance, at that point in time, the Muslim world, prior to the Renaissance, was doing very well. Europe was in the Middle Ages. The Muslim world, for example, if you were a Muslim in Delhi, or you were a Muslim in Isfahan, or you were a Muslim in, for example, the Middle East, you were doing relatively better than people in Europe. But the printing press emerged. The printing press came simultaneously with the Protestant Reformation. Many times people compare Shia Islam and Sunni Islam to Protestantism and Catholicism. There may be some room for this comparison, but there's a big flaw in this comparison. What is that? You see, Sunniism and Shiism both trace their origin to the beginning of Islam. They may debate about it, but they both say they go to the beginning of Islam. But if you look at the history of Protestantism, which developed America, Protestantism came roughly 600 years ago, in the 14th century AD. It came well after Catholicism and other veins of, for example, of Christianity. Or for example, if you look at Mormonism and Latter-day Saints, it came roughly 200 years ago. I say this because if you don't understand these principles, you will be disconnected from America.
And if we're disconnected from America, it will be very hard for us to create an American Shia Muslim identity, an American Shia Muslim culture. So how did we get here? In the Renaissance, ideas emerged, such as skepticism, such as doubt. For example, René Descartes, he says, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. I'm answering these issues that Syed Sistani says, answer the doubts that are in the minds of the youth with solid evidence. I'm giving you that solid evidence right now. So Descartes says, I think, therefore I am, based on skepticism. Skepticism has given us many benefits, such as what? It's given us benefits such as the scientific method and progress. Enlightenment took that even a step further. But here's the crux. 1798 to 1801, Napoleon invades Egypt. When Napoleon invades Egypt, that is when colonialism begins. France and England begin to divide up the entire world through colonialism. So for example, they start to divide up Africa, they start to divide up Asia. For example, the British start to colonize India. You find that the French begin to colonize Northern Africa, for example, Algiers and Tunisia and the likes, for example. You begin to notice, for example, Lebanon and the likes, the Levant is colonized by the French. The Persians, for example, they chose French colonialism over British colonialism. The idea being for them, do you want a heart attack or do you want cancer? So they picked for example, the French. When this happened, that influence permeated throughout these societies. And they began to intellectually colonize. So what did they do? This is extremely important. Please bear with me on this extremely important point. They set up schools of Orientalism in these places such as India, such as North Africa, such as the Middle East. They started funding, in England, they started funding, and in Paris, in the Sorbonne and other institutions, they began to fund schools of Orientalism. What is Orientalism? Orientalism is to look at another society with your own eyes. So for example, to look at the East with Western eyes. So they were looking at India, for example, the British, to look at it from the lens of England, to look at how the Indians live, so that they can manage and rule over India better. It was an administrative thing. The French were doing the same. Understand the society so we can manage the North Africans, the Algerians, the Tunisians better. It was a management task. Here's the problem. The opposite of Orientalism is Occidentalism. Occidentalism is to look at the West with Eastern eyes. To look at, for example, a Japanese individual or researcher or academic looking at America from their eyes. Or for example, an Indian academic looking at the West from their eyes. Or a Middle Eastern or a Persian looking at it from their eyes. That didn't take off. Occidentalism, the opposite of Orientalism, didn't take off. So this left the East trying to catch up with modernity, as they framed it. So why is this important to you and I? There's another thing that you need to know. That you began to realize and you began to think that Islam is backwards. Any society that is not Western or European or North American is backwards. This was the first level of an inferiority complex. The next level is what's called what happened through convents. You see, in the Middle East, in Persia, in the Indian subcontinent, these different churches, for example, convents, began to establish monasteries. When they began to establish monasteries in North Africa, in the Middle East, and in Asia, they had a goal of converting the population. But they were not successful in converting the population. For example, they did not convert Muslims to Christians. That didn't work. But the researchers and the academics at universities such as George Washington University, at Georgetown University, at SUNY University, and all these different universities say they were successful in one very valuable thing for them. And that was they removed Islamic culture from the people. How did that happen? Convents in India, convents including modern-day Pakistan and Bangladesh, convents, for example, in the Middle East. For example, you may not know this, but the premier institution of higher education in the Arab world is the American University of Beirut. That is what it's called now, but it was established as the Syrian Protestant University, or the Syrian Presbyterian University, Presbyterian being a form of Protestantism. Why is this so significant? Because the intelligentsia, the most intelligent people, the elite of all of these societies in the Middle East, they began to send their children to the American University in Beirut. The same thing happened in India. The same thing happened in Persia. So the best people, the highly educated people, the affluent people, they began to send their children to convents. They didn't convert, but it stripped them and it removed from there their Islamic culture and their Islamic identity. You may not realize it, but you may have already been intellectually colonized for several generations. Does this mean I'm against modernity? Does this mean I'm against society? No, not at all. But rather I'm coming forward and saying, trying to help you understand, where does your worldview come from? It may not be your own. You may have inherited it well before you came to the shores of North America. But you don't gather that. You don't realize that. We don't often realize that. And once we begin to realize this, then we can start to begin to create an Islamic, American, Shia, Muslim identity of our modern world. You know, we talked about the different layers, the different levels. When we don't understand culture, when we don't understand religion, these are the problems that arise. We need to send a group of our youngsters, our next generation, to go to the Hawza, not only to learn in the Hawza al-Ilmiya of Qum and Najaf, but to get to the upper echelons of it. To the higher levels of the Hawza, to become mujtahideen, to become scholars, so that they can have the impact and give the benefit to the society and the world in which we live, in the world in which we operate. Where do we go from here? Where do we build up from here? We will recall that I said there are certain dimensions to culture. For example, there's how you talk, the linguistics. We talked about dahak. We talked about norms. In Japan, when you move luggage, it's not a big deal. In America, very big deal to move luggage, someone else's luggage. What about education? What about education? Let's talk about that for a moment. You see, in America and in Western Europe, the education system has one particular goal. What is that particular goal of the education system? According to experts in this field, not my words, huh? They say the focus and the purpose of the education system in Western Europe and North America is single-fold. It's one focus. What is that? It is in order for you to get a job. This is one framework. Very well. The Native Americans have a very different way of how they educate. They educate in terms of small, close-knit circle groups. And they come forward and say that we have a focus on nurturing people as opposed to preparing them for a job. That's not our focus. That's not our purpose. That's not why we're here. You see, in the Hawza al-Ilmiya, they've been doing this for 1,000 years. They don't believe in preparing someone just to get a job. Their focus in Najaf and in Qum is very different. They've had these closed circle discussions for centuries, especially in the Hawza al-Ilmiya of Najaf. Their focus is to give a nurturing environment academically to help train the person. They have their own way of things being there. And for you and I to come forward and say that this is how things should be, it's being ethnocentric, to impose my frame of the world on them. You're welcome to go there. You're welcome to study there. You're welcome to understand there. And by the way, you and I would be very naive to think that culture doesn't have an impact on how we operate in the world, in our jurisprudence. If you don't believe me, look at the history of Iran. After the Islamic Revolution of Iran in 1979, whatever your political views on the revolution, I have no interest in that. I'm a muqallid of Syed Sistani, but I'm giving a historical fact to you. Chess was banned. Chess was outlawed, based on the idea of what the Ahlul Bayt have said very negatively about playing chess or shatranj. But given the culture of Iran, for centuries people had played chess, and it was part and parcel of the fabric of their society. He overturned that decision, and he actually made it permissible to play chess, with the intent of this being an intellectual game and not being used as an instrument of gambling. Now the ulama of Najaf didn't see eye to eye with this, but that was his view. So it overturned a ruling that was already there. Furthermore, what's another example? Music. Music was totally banned after the 79 revolution in Iran. Totally unacceptable. But it was overturned. What was overturned? In fact, they played. It was overturned to allow classical music. This is what they did. So state radio actually played classical music in Iran. This happened. The Beethoven and the concertos related to that. You see, whether we realize it or not, there is influence that is taking place. And in the ghaiba of the Imam, this system, by the way, will not be perfect. But because it's not perfect does not mean that you and I don't follow it. We have the option of either becoming scholars ourselves, for example, or we have the honor of being able to follow our scholars who take the burden on their own shoulders. Where does this cultural environment come from? The educational environment within the Hawza al-Ilmiya. Have you ever thought about where does the term Ayatullah come from? Ayatullah is a term, and I'm telling you something new, something different you may not have known. Ayatullah was not a term that was used for scholars during the time of Ahlul Bayt. It was not used during the time of the Imams, for example, but it was used during the aftermath or after the Imams. When was it used, for example? It was used, the first person, if you look at the history, Allah has said Ayatullah means sign of Allah. This term is littered throughout the Quran al-Majid al-Furqan al-Hamid. The sign of Allah, the ayat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But also this term Hujjatul Islam. You see, at the higher levels in the Hawza, Hujjatul Islam is just before Ayatullah from the Mujtahid, and above them is a Grand Marja or a Ayatullah al-Uzma, a Grand Ayatullah. Where did these terms come from? The first person who was given a title, and you need to know these names and these personalities and these concepts. This began with an individual by the name of Yaqub al-Kulayni, Sheikh al-Kulayni. Sheikh al-Kulayni was called Fiqatul Islam. Fiqatul Islam means the trustworthy of Islam. You need to know this individual because he has done a tremendous service to Shia Islam. He's one of the people who formed Shia Islam as we know it. There are 4 books of Shia Islam that you need to know inside out for every generation. That is Usul al-Kafi by Yaqub al-Kulayni. And then you need to know At-Tahzib, Istibsar, and Man La Yahbar al-Faqih. These are the 4 books of Shiaism, of Tashayyu, you need to know. Yaqub al-Kulayni is the one who wrote this book. He was called Fiqatul Islam. Fiqatul Islam, the term fiqh means trustworthy. It comes from the ahadith. When you look at the ahadith literature, the ulama look at the chain of the narrators and they say, is this person trustworthy, trustworthy, trustworthy? And then they come to the end and they say, is this entire hadith trustworthy or not? And then they come forward and say, this person is fiqh. Sheikh al-Kulayni was respected not only by all of the Sunni scholars, all the Shia scholars in all the Muslim world. That's why he was called Fiqatul Islam. Because anything he said was trustworthy, according to all Muslims. He lived during the era of Ghaybat al-Sughra, the era in the time of Imam Sahib Rasul-Zaman, where he had the 4 naibs, the 4 nawab, the 4 deputies. That era, he lived through all of them. And he compiled 16,000 ahadith. Sheikh al-Kulayni is not a light name, it's a heavy name. You need to know this name. And he's that person. He moved from Qom or Tehran to Qom, and then he moved to Baghdad. In Baghdad, he spent 20 years compiling Usul al-Kafi. 16,000 traditions. 16,000 traditional Usul al-Kafi are more than all of the traditions of our brothers in Ahlul Sunnah combined. If you look at the 6 books, the Sahih al-Sitta, for example, Bukhari, Muslim, Tirmidhi, Ibn Majah, Abu Dawood, Nasa'i, if you look at these books of our brothers in Ahlul Sunnah, and you take out all the repetition, you will find there's only about 10,000 or so ahadith that they have. Sheikh Kulayni found 16,000 by himself in one book. You know, Sheikh al-Kulayni, he said to himself that he was in Baghdad, and one day he thought to himself, before he had published this book, and before he made it public, he said that I cannot take the burden that what if I say and I narrate one hadith in this that's not authentic? If I narrate one hadith in this that is not authentic, till the day of Qiyamah, Yawm al-Qiyamah, my neck will have the burden of it. So what did he do? He went to the Furat. He said, I'm going to put this in the Furat tomorrow. I'm going to put my entire work, my entire book into the Furat. That night he fell asleep. When he fell asleep, in the dream he sees the Imam. When he sees the Imam in his dream at that point in time, the Imam alayhi salam, he says to him, Al-Kafi, Kafi li Shi'atina. That this book that you have written, Al-Kafi, it is Kafi, it is sufficient for our Shia. And therefore he did not drain it into the Furat. And it is one of the most reliable books that our scholars depend on. He was the one who was called Fiqatul Islam, the trustworthy of Islam, in the 4th century. We go further, I'm talking about the educational system here. The first person to be called Hujjatul Islam, which is a title, an honorific title below Ayatullah, Hujjatul Islam was actually a Sunni scholar by the name of Imam Muhammad al-Ghazali. Imam Muhammad al-Ghazali did many good things, but he also was the one who gave the fatwa against rationalism. He's the one who said that mathematics is the work of the devil. This is that person. But nonetheless, he was called Hujjatul Islam. And this was where that term came from. As we go further, the first person, then there was an individual by the name of Muhaqqiq. That Muhaqqiq means the researcher of Hilla. Muhaqqiq al-Hilli. This was the uncle of Allama al-Hilli. Allama Hilli, who many of you will have known, the very famous intellectual and scholar who is also respected by all the madahib. So therefore, Muhakkik al-Hilli was the one who was known as the researcher of Hilli, the uncle of Allama al-Hilli. The first person to be called Allama and Ayatullah that we know in our history is that individual who is by the name of Allama al-Hilli. Allama Hilli is that individual who was such a genius that they say they were waiting for him to become a marja because he had not even hit the age of puberty. He had not even hit the age of bulugh. This individual was so intelligent and mischievous at the same time. We are told when he was not baligh, his father would be chasing him, also an alim, would be chasing him around the house. When he'd be chasing him around the house, at one point in time, Allama al-Hilli's father would corner him. When he would corner him, he'd say, I've got you now. And he would go to hug his son and to stop his son from being mischievous. And at that very moment, Allama al-Hilli would recite a verse of Quran that is wajib sajda. One that his father would have to go directly into prostration, into sujood, into sajda, and he would just run around the corner. This was Allama al-Hilli. This Allama al-Hilli did a great service for tashayyu. He is the person who gave us our modern world in so many respects of tashayyu and worked so hard. He was the first person to be called Allama and the first individual to be called Ayatullah. That is the sign of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When you go further, you begin to find other people. The next major person in modern times, in the last 300 years, who was called Ayatullah was Syed Mahdi Bahrul Ulum, from the very famous Bahrul Ulum family. That is the oceans of knowledge family. These are Sadat, from the Hassani Sadat, from the Tabatabai al-Hakim family. They were given the title because the knowledge of Sayyid Mahdi and the likes of the oceans of knowledge. You know, understanding culture in Islam, Sayyid Mahdi is that individual who they saw him in a procession of Ashura, a procession of Ahlul Bayt. This individual is that person who was one of the Marja al-Azam at the time. He's going in a procession. A scholar has a particular demeanor. A scholar has a particular way of being. Sometimes our scholars have a particular way of standing. They notice in this gathering that Sayyid Mahdi takes his amama and he throws it towards the ground and he begins to do ma'atam very, very hard and very, very fast in a group of people who are just normal lay people. When he does this, they say, Sayyid Mahdi, you are the a'lam marja of the time, the most learned of the time. This is not befitting of you, that you would do something like this, that you would do ma'atam in this way, that you would beat your chest in this way. How? He said, if you saw the Imam of our time doing ma'atam, you wouldn't say this to me. Allahu Akbar. You know, we sometimes, when we discuss ethics and culture, we see someone who is doing the ma'atam of Sayyid al-Shuhada. We look at someone who's doing even, for example, whatever form of lamentation of Sayyid al-Shuhada, we sometimes have no respect to say when we begin to say this person is jahil. Na'udhu billah, hasha lillah. Fear, have some etiquette. This person is the azadar of Sayyid al-Shuhada. And how do we know how that Imam Sahib al-Zaman does azab? You know, we're told Imam Sahib al-Zaman, we're told that he says in Zarat al-Nahya, oh my grandfather Sayyid al-Shuhada, I cry day and night for you. And when my tears, they go dry, I cry blood for you. Have we understood? Do not start to be ethnocentric and say that because I live in America and I live in Western Europe and I live in developed society, therefore you should practice Islam the way I practice it. No. In America, you create your own form of cultural Islam. Within the bounds, within the parameters of the fiqh and the jurisprudence that the scholars have said. That's not to mean that I can go and create my own and say that, oh, I believe Islam should be this way. No. The reason why people in America say that I am going to do things my way is because of how Protestantism gave rise to America. You need to know that history, otherwise you won't know how America operates. Therefore, understanding this, know that when it comes to issues of social justice, when it comes to issues of civic engagement, when it comes to issues of mental health, when it comes to issues of substance abuse, when it comes to issues of disability, when it comes to issues of domestic violence in our communities, we need to start speaking up on these matters. We need to start becoming those people who talk about these matters. There's an election that's coming up. I'm not here to tell you who to vote for. That's not my job. That's not the idara's job. But what your job is to consider, what is my role in this environment? Sayyid Ja'far al-Hakim, one of the top scholars in the Hawza Ilmiya of Najaf, came to North America and went to center, and he went to Europe and the major countries. And he said, are you not citizens of this republic? Are you not citizens of the United States? Therefore, do you not have some responsibility to your civilization, to your society, to your republic? Yes, there are issues that are happening overseas. There are foreign policy issues. But I tell you, the answer to your foreign policy issues are in your domestic policy engagement. I remember I was in a gathering of several influential members of our community, and the issues of Shia killing came up, which may, God forbid, may Allah protect everyone. It may be that these rise again, especially given the climate overseas right now. They said, what is it that we can do? A top academic from our community, from the Shia community, you see, how policy is influenced is academia, the legislative branch, Congress and Senate, and then ultimately the presidential branch, the executive branch. This happens in every major country, especially in the United States. The academics say that if you want to influence this society, I remember speaking to a leader in academic in our community, if you want to stop what's happening there, and the killing of Shias, this is what you do. Those countries are very interested in the funding that comes from Western developed societies. And if you get the attention of a congressman, of a senator, of a person at your local level, and you begin to say, I'm an American citizen, and I'm concerned about my brethren, about the minority communities in certain countries being killed because of extremists, and we fund those countries, you will start getting results. Because those representatives will start to say, we're pulling funding. And then those people will be forced to act. See, your concerns about foreign policy lie in your domestic policy. I'm not going to tell you who to vote for. The Idara is not going to tell you who to vote for. But you have to do the research to say that this is my republic. As Syed Ja'far al-Hakim said, you need to get involved. Whatever capacity you choose to do. Do your research to get involved. What about social justice? Our brothers and sisters, the African American community, some Shia Muslims, do we look after them? Do we care for them? Are they part of our deen? Are they part of our mazhab? In Islamic Shia, Islamic culture in America, will we include them? Or are we supposed to join them? How will we work together to build? People are being killed left, right, and center. Do Black Lives Matter? Is that a concern of us? I know for young people who are watching this, it's a major concern. But are we addressing this in our communities? What would the Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam want us to do? To sit on the sidelines? To not say anything? To not at least write a letter? To not at least say something? What about the documentary that was done by a major media outlet that looked at the drug epidemic in our Shia community in America in a particular town, in a particular city? Do you know that there are members of our community who suffer? They suffer. Families who have had to bury their children due to substance abuse. Nobody talks about this. And you know what? They say, don't tell anyone about it because there's too much shame to bear and we have to suffer in silence. Imagine losing a young child at 20, 21, 22, 23, and then having to suffer on top of that in silence because you're concerned what the community is going to say about you. Is this Islam? Is this what the Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam taught? That we torture and torment? When will we get to the environment when we think about support groups in our Shia community? You see, when we go outside of our community, there are support groups for people who are suffering from substance abuse. There are support groups for people who have mental health issues. There are support groups for people suffering from domestic violence. Why do we not have Shia support groups for mental health, for example, for other issues, for other topics, for other situations that are going on? That won't happen until you and I take a stand for the Shia Muslim American community and start to develop these things. What about disability? Two of my best friends have been people who are disabled, visually disimpaired, they cannot see. Do you know, they tell me how difficult it is for them to be part of the community. My dear brothers and sisters, if you have a disabled friend, please reach out to them. Do you know what isolation disabled people go through? Especially in our communities, there's no one to talk to them. There's no one to socialize with them. There's no one to ask them how they're doing because they're not accessible. Because, for example, if I have to go out, I have to alter my plans because this person, for example, can't see a movie, for example. This person cannot do X, Y, and Z. We need support groups in our community. We need civic engagement in our community. We need social engagement in our community, social justice. This won't happen until you and I take a stand to start to develop Shia Muslim American culture that is indigenous here. in light of Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam, in light of Al Muhammad. And I'm looking at the Idara as an institution that is a trailblazer, particularly being strategically located in Washington, D.C. or the greater Washington, D.C. region. How will we build the future of the American Shia Muslim community that other communities can emulate? The communities in California, the communities in Michigan, the communities in Florida, the communities throughout, to see how do we build that identity. And don't be ethnocentric. Be compassionate, be caring, and follow the manhaj. Remember my lines. Remember this word. And remember this truth. Look at every individual as a project of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When you start looking at everyone, including yourself, as a project of Allah, a work in progress of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, your lens will change. You will stop saying that that person's wrong and that person's this and that person's that. You'll stop gossiping. You'll start doing tahma. You'll stop doing buhtan. You'll stop doing ghiba. And you'll begin to live the compassionate life, the loving life, the affectionate life. How will we create and cultivate a better future for our next generation? The same way the Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam wanted us to do. We turn our hearts and minds to Karbala, but no to Kufa, no to Sham. You know, in this time of COVID, my heart misses that zari that you have. That zari, that shabi of the zari of Abul Fadl al-Abbas. And you know, it's my promise that whenever I'm there, I recite. I give one night to Abul Fadl al-Abbas. You see, Abul Fadl al-Abbas is that person who's Babul Hawaij. My dear brothers and sisters, if ever you have a difficulty in your life, there is the door of Abul Fadl al-Abbas. This modern world cannot explain the miracle of Abul Fadl al-Abbas. This modern world cannot explain Babul Hawaij. But I tell you with my hand on my heart, I know that as truth. I've seen Abul Fadl al-Abbas through Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give people in my travels throughout Europe, throughout America, throughout Canada, wherever I've gone. People not having children, they got children through the door of Abul Fadl al-Abbas. Through Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because Abbas, Allah said, Abu Fadl, you had two wishes. You wanted to fight on the day of Ashura, and you wanted to get water to the tent of Sakina. We didn't give you your two wishes. We didn't grant you your two du'as. But from now until Yawm al-Qiyamah, Abu Fadl, any dua you want, any desire you want, anything that you want, that any of your mu'mineen want, they will get it through you. Not only that, Allah gave Baneen, the mother of Abul Fadl al-Abbas, the power of shifa and the power of granting du'as. I tell you, if you ever have a difficulty in life, remember this. In the most difficult and dire, and I've tested this, you call me if it doesn't work for you, with yaqeen and certainty in your heart. If you're in the most difficult time, 133 times recite Ya Kashif al-Karbi an Wajh al-Husayn, Ikshif Karbi bihaqqi Akhik al-Husayn. 133 times, and you give Allah the wasta and the wasila of Abu Fadl al-Abbas, and you tell me if it's not answered. That's the power of Abu Fadl al-Abbas. And another thing I will tell you, the Fatiha of Baneen. My young brothers and sisters, never forget this. Because when I was in Europe, I found young people who would recite the Fatiha of Baneen. And they said, in the most dire of times, this helped us. And all you do is you dedicate the sawab of the Fatiha, your dua is accepted, you gift the sawab to Baneen. I thought about it, why Baneen? That Allah gave such a power. You see, Baneen, on the day of Ashura, she had 4 sons. She had Abbas, she had Abdullah, she had Uthman, she had Ja'far. Uthman named after Uthman ibn Mad'un, the friend and the colleague and the companion of Amir al-Mu'mineen. She gave every single one of them. You see, if someone had 4 sons, you would imagine that she had 1 son for each corner of her coffin, 1 son for each corner of her janaza, 1 son for each corner of her body. But when Baneen left this world, All of her sons went in the day of Ashura. There was no one to lift the body of al-Baneen. Remember that Allah said that through the messenger, heaven lies under the feet of the mother. The mother of Babul Hawaij, Abul Fadl al-Abbas, is al-Baneen. That Babul Hawaij, your Jannah is under the feet of al-Baneen. So how is it that we cannot accept the dua of the mother of Abul Fadl al-Abbas? Ajrukum ala Allah, ajrukum ala Allah. I've taken much of your time. Give these 2 moments to Abul Fadl al-Abbas and give it to his mother Baneen. Imam Sajjad on the day of Ashura, when Aba Abdullah al-Hussein came into the khayma, Sayyid Sajjad sees his father. He says one line. He says, my father Aba Abdullah, Aina Ammi al-Abbas. Where is my uncle Abu Fadl al-Abbas? How is it that you are riddled with arrows? How is it that you are in blood? And he said, Qad qutil. My son, he has been killed. Imam Sajjad let out a cry. The Qamaru Bani Hashim has been killed. He cried so much. But I want to tell you what al-Baneen says. And this is when your heart breaks. What did al-Baneen say? al-Baneen said that Abbas, she would go to Jannatul Baqi, and when she would go to Jannatul Baqi, she would draw into the sand one grave and another grave, 4 graves she would put, and it's as if she would say, wipe them away and say, Ya Hussein, Wa Hussein, as if my children are nothing in front of you, Ya Hussein. They say there was a zakir, a reciter. He was reciting the musibah of Sayyid al-Shuhada. When he was reciting the musibah of Sayyid al-Shuhada, we are told that he recited the musibah of Abul Fadl al-Abbas. That night, Abul Fadl al-Abbas came in his dream. When Abul Fadl al-Abbas came in his dream, he said, Oh Zakir, oh reciter, you don't recite my masayib. You don't recite my musibah. He said, Abu Fadl, Abbas, I tell them how your hands were cut. I tell them how they struck you. I tell them how they shot an arrow towards your face. He says, Oh Zakir, you don't tell them how I fell from the horse. When someone falls from a horse, they have their hands to support them. Oh Zakir, I had no hands. I fell from the horse. I fell without hands towards the ground. Ajrukum ala Allah, ajrukum ala Allah. At that point, Sayyid Mahdi Bahrul Ulum, the one who I mentioned a few moments ago, there is a narration narrated to him. They say that when Sayyid Mahdi Bahrul Ulum, he went with some Shia Zairin, he went to the trenches, he went to the Zari of Abul Fadl al-Abbas, and they saw the Zari. And at that time, 300 years ago, when they saw the Zari, they said, Agha, they said, Sayyid, we thought Abul Fadl al-Abbas was very tall. We thought he was a tall man. Oh, Sayyid, why is his grave so small? Sayyid Mahdi began to beat himself. He said he was very tall, but the enemy, they cut Abbas into so many pieces that is what we have left from Abbas. Ajrukum ala Allah, ajrukum ala Allah. The final narration, and I will leave you. They say Baneen would ask after Karbala, when she would be in Jannatul Baqi, she would say, Abbas, you let Hussein die. What is it? How did this happen? Abbas, I will not forgive you. But then she would say, Abbas, I will not blame you. I heard they cut your hands, and that you had no hands, and that you were swaying on the horse. And when you were swaying on the horse, Abbas, I just have one question Baneen asked. Abbas, when you fell from the horse, did your chest hit the ground first, or did your face hit the ground first? Baneen, 1,000 salams on you. But neither his chest hit first, and neither did his face hit first. Baneen, the arrow in the eye of Abbas hit first. That arrow hit first and went through his arm. على لعنة الله على القوم الظالمين وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون إنا لله وإنا إليه إليك راجعون. صلى الله عليك يا أبا عبد الله. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين.
If you could please recite Surah Al-Fatiha for Syed Zahir Haidar Zadi, Sayyida Raisa Khatun, Sayyid Azhar Sajjad, Mahmouda Begum, Sayyida Azra Zadi, and for your marhumin and all marhumin mu'minat. Al-Fatiha. Mahtam al-Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein.
Sayyid, thank you so much for the wonderful recitation. We kindly ask our brother Ali Raza for An-Noha. Hussein, 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 Hussein.
Hussein, 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 Hussein. Sham, oh Sham, 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 Sham, oh Sham. Oh, fourth Imam, oh, you have answered. Oh, fourth Imam, oh, you have answered. The most difficult time was in Sham, Sham, oh Sham, Sham, oh Sham, Sham, oh Sham, Sham, oh Sham. Oh grandfather, what should we tell you of the hardships and cruelty we suffered? We were taken as displays in the streets, your family ill-treated and slandered. Oh grandfather, if you could only, oh grandfather, if you could only witness how we were abused in Sham, Sham, oh Sham, Sham, oh Sham, Sham, oh Sham, Sham, oh Sham. The women and children tormented by the image of the heads on the spears. Their faces and heads were uncovered, their innocent faces in tears. Oh grandmother, if you could only, oh grandmother, if you could only look at how we were helpless in Sham, Sham, oh Sham, Sham, oh Sham, Sham, oh Sham. Our little Ruqayya had suffered, she longed to return to Medina. After Karbala, Kufa, and then Sham, she yearned for her sister Fatima. Oh little Ruqayya, we miss you. Oh little Ruqayya, we miss you. You died as a prisoner in Sham, Sham, oh Sham, Sham, oh Sham, Sham, oh Sham, Sham,
Sham. Oh, Uncle Abbas, our defender, we were left without any protection. Your courage and strength would have saved us from the tyrants who imposed affliction. But the enemies brutally killed you. But the enemies brutally killed you. We were imprisoned here in Sham, Sham, oh Sham, Sham, oh Sham, Sham, oh Sham, Sham, oh Sham. Our beloved fourth Imam Sajjad, we pray you take this as a token from the love in our hearts for you, Sajjad. These letters and words have been written. Oh, Bibi Zainab and Ruqayya, oh, Bibi Zainab and Ruqayya, invite us to meet you in Sham, Sham, oh Sham, Sham, oh Sham, Sham, oh Sham. Ya Hussein.
Hussein, Jazakallah khair.
Mominin Mominat, we will take a break and we will be back around 8:45 p.m. for our Urdu program, inshallah.